The Open Highway podcast is a production of Viking Dog Entertainment, and now you can visit the all-new Viking Dog store for access to everything that Viking Dog has to offer. Movies, books, and apparel, including motivational lines, open highway merchandise, and exclusive wolf designs that raise money for wolf rescue organizations. So visit thevikingdogstore.com today. How did you get into UFOs? I'm just going to go straight to the question right at the top. How do you get into that unless you were abducted as a child?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it's a couple different things. One is, like a lot of, 8, 10, 12-year-old boys and girls. I was just into UFOs, in the 70s. There's UFO magazines, UFO comic books. This is the time when there were these fairly cheap but shown at the theaters movies about UFOs or Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or whatever. So it kind of felt like a little bit of like a golden age for that kind of stuff. So I guess that was sort of my early interest. We also had a family friend who was sort of a prominent skeptic. So growing up, when we go out and visit my grandparents for Christmas in New Mexico, we'd always see them. So I had a chance to kind of interrogate this guy with my, the latest things I'd read in Gold Key UFO comics or whatever. And he kind of give me the give me the skeptical skinny on it.
Did he sit you down? He's like, "Look, kid, don't believe everything you read."
I think he was kind of amused by the whole thing. And I think he was probably the same way. I mean, I think that's how you get into it, whether you're a skeptic or sort of more, investigating with the idea that there's something there, is that you start off fairly young and find it interesting, this idea that we might be being visited by beings from another planet. And that's like a kind of cool and heady thing when you're that age. And then, so, it's always been, I've had friends who had the same thing, where they grew up and they're kind of interested in it. And when I was in my 20s and living in DC, every once in a while we go to like the Blockbuster or the local independent video store and get like In Search of Volume 4 or whatever, and just like sit around, drink beers and watch that. So there's always, there's this sort of continuing kind of half interest in it. But so what got me into this sort of second, more intense period of looking into this stuff was, I've been doing, for about 7 years, I've been on this podcast that looks at crime and popular culture. And we've reviewed a ton of podcasts and, critiquing them. And I sort of got to the point where I said, I feel like maybe it would be useful to try and make a podcast just to kind of see how I would address all these things that I'm sort of evaluating in other people. And, so I started thinking about what is it that I would find interesting to spend time with. And I really wanted to do something about belief and skepticism. And, why do people believe things that you don't have the same kind of concrete evidence for that you would want like normally in your life? Mm-hmm. And so part of, some of that's religion, right? But I didn't want to make a religion podcast.
You didn't want to walk into that much trouble.
Yeah,
so you figured...
Exactly. Like A, I didn't want to walk into that much trouble. B, why anybody would want to listen to me talk about religion? It would be completely beyond me. So I live in New Hampshire. I live in the town where the University of New Hampshire is, and they have the Betty and Barney Hill archives. And for people who don't know who they are, and I'm sure we're going to talk about them, they were a couple who lived about 8 miles from where I live now, who in 1961, claimed and thought that they had been abducted by aliens while they were driving back to the seacoast of New Hampshire from Montreal in the middle of the night up in the White Mountains. So knowing that there was this sort of trove of documents and recordings and different things, and this is where all the information was, and I was working at University of New Hampshire at the time, so it seemed like a good way of maybe accessing some of those questions about skepticism and belief. So that's kind of how it got started. I just sort of I vaguely knew what the story was, and then I just dove into the archives and found what I found.
Yeah, so Betty and Barney Hill were arguably the first public abduction. Like we could make this argument that who knows who's claimed it before, but they were kind of the first people that came out and said in the modern era this happened. I think that's accurate.
Yeah, I mean the people are going to split hairs. There was a guy in Brazil. His last name was Villas Boas.
Is that the guy who had sex with the
yeah,
that's an amazing story. There's pictures out there.
Have
you ever seen them?
No, I have not. I haven't.
I had a book. I might have it. I'm not going to pull it out, but I have a book where they animated his entire story.
Oh my God.
And they're very attractive aliens that he ends up with.
that was his testimony. And he had sexual congress with this alien woman who screamed like a animal and pointed up to the stars and said, I'm taking your kid back to my home planet. At least that's what he thought this alien was saying. So that happened, but there, Betty and Barney Hill didn't know about that. That didn't really hit the U.S. until later, and it still wasn't nearly as big as Betty and Barney Hill. So yeah, there's this sort of, as I started doing research, there's kind of this interesting, when people talk about the modern era of UFOs, they take a look at 1947, which is when this guy, Kenneth Arnold, who was a pilot, was flying around Mount Rainier, and he says he saw these sort of disc shaped, not exactly disc shaped. He thought they looked a little bit more sort of boomerang-ish, I guess.
Yeah.
But flying at really high speeds, clearly weren't planes. And he reported this. And then less than a month later was Roswell, which everybody knows about. So this 1947 is sort of when the modern UFO era begins.
And he, if I remember the story right, he didn't say flying saucer. He made a comment like they skipped like saucers or something like that, and the media ran with it. First fake news. And
exactly.
And that's where that term came from. And he was even upset about it because he's like, I never said that, and I seem to remember somewhere him getting interviewed about that. But that's where we get the term flying saucer, even though he was like, no, like you said, they were boomerang shaped or they were a different shape.
Yeah. So. And then I think one of the interesting things is that from then on for a while, what people are seeing are UFOs that are shaped like saucers, right? Mm-hmm. So you take this sort of misquote from a newspaper, it gets out into the culture, and then that's what people start reporting seeing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just one of many sort of examples of how, UFO sightings and the way people talk about them are culturally driven. So what happens in the 50s, and this is all leading up to Betty and Barney Hill, is that there's this group of people called the contactees, and I'd say they're not like people who, were necessarily friends with each other, but it's generally men, and they have these stories where they're being visited by people from other planets, these people tend to look like humans and have these sort of hippie messages of peace and, we're worried you're going to destroy yourselves and all this stuff. And it's kind of hard for me to believe that anybody took it that seriously. Like, do you really think there's like a spaceman from Venus is coming to visit us and like warn us about nuclear weapons or whatever? But this was kind of what sort of an encounter with an alien looked like in the 50s, was these stories by these men that had these kind of morality aspects to them.
It was the day the earth stood still story. We're going to come and fix it because you guys are screwing it up.
Yeah. 100%. And these are also like George Adamski. Like he'd been kind of talking about this stuff as part of like a weird sort of cultish type church that he ran. And then he kind of morphed that into, I met a Venusian and he said the same stuff that I've been like kind of preaching. So that was kind of where things were in 1961. And what's really interesting about Betty and Barney Hill is that their story was so much different. Their story was not about meeting, people from space who are a lot like us or who had a message for us or anything like that. What they describe is really sort of a encounter with the uncanny. Like it's not something that you could relate to any other experience that you had. And sometimes the way they talk about it, they use language to describe them, the aliens, which seems to associate them more sort of emotionally with how they're perceiving the creatures rather than like an actual physical description. At least that's my interpretation of it.
They were terrified. I mean, I was listening. You had it on your show when they talk about the reactions, because then I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but they were eventually hypnotized. But when that came out, it wasn't a happy experience like you talk about the ones before that, where it's like all peace, love, and aliens. They were terrified at what they went through, and that's different.
Yeah, it's, and again, I mean, I think that's what makes the story stand out so much, is that it's relatable. I mean, not to go through the whole every detail of the story, but essentially they're Betty and Barney Hill are an interracial couple. Barney's black, Betty's white. This is in 1961 in New Hampshire, so it's sort of an unusual couple in that respect. They're respected members of the community, civil rights activists. I actually have friends who knew them, and think very highly of them. So they're driving back from Montreal to get to the seacoast of New Hampshire, and the way you do that is you drive through the White Mountains and through this one little gap, basically, that's called Franconia Notch. And you drive through it, and there's mountains going up on either side of you, fairly steep mountains. So it's sort of this narrow passageway. And as they approach Franconia Notch, they see a light in the sky. It seems to be following them. And then when they get into the notch itself, there used to be this rock formation called the Old Man the Mountain, which was a tourist destination, and it was like a symbol of New Hampshire. It's like on all our highway signs and stuff.
Yeah.
And they see a ship with lights on it appear by the Old Man the Mountain, and they make some. They're freaked out, and then they can kind of get a sense of how big it is, which is fairly big compared to the Old Man the Mountain. And they get in their car, and they keep driving, and they sort of comes in and out of sight. And then they get out of the Franconian Notch, and they're driving south, and they come to this place called Indian Head, which is another rock formation. And suddenly, this craft is right above their car, and they pull over, and the craft goes out into this field. And that's when Barney gets out of the car and looks through his binoculars at the ship, at the craft, and sees figures looking back at him. And this is something they remembered throughout, was this experience. But the sort of account that we get is while Barney is later, when Barney is under hypnosis, and he describes the figures that he sees. He says one is dressed like a Nazi, and he says another one looks like an Irishman, but a friendly Irishman.
What is that? I'm not sure. What does that mean?
Well, my sense of it is, so Barney worked at a post office in Boston, and as a black man, this is, Boston was not very racially progressive at the time, and my sense is that he sort of perceived, and he kind of hinted this a little bit, perceived seeing an Irishman as being somebody who was going to be antagonistic towards him.
Okay.
And he said, because he says, I see this, he looks like an Irishman, but he's being friendly. And when an Irishman's friendly, that surprises me, or I can't remember exactly how he puts it. But anyway, that seems like a little cognitive dissonance to him.
That's interesting, just because if you look at it, I think we have this cultural thing where we look at somebody who tells us a story and we forget that they're still human beings. They still have, their prejudices or their way of looking at whatever, and that's going to feed into their story, whether or not you believe it or whatever. This is totally separate than that. It's our way of looking at things. So that's interesting that he would color it that way with the Irish statement.
Yeah,
because that's just that's his metrics.
Right. And then the Nazi, he fought in World War II. He actually he got his teeth blown out of his mouth by a grenade. I think that's right. And so what he perceives when he talks later about what he sees, what he's identifying are sort of two groups of people who he feels are antagonistic towards him. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think it's more of more of an emotional response rather than a visual response is what we're kind of getting when he talks about it.
That makes sense.
Again, it's a really interesting story. So essentially he walks towards the craft and then gets really scared. I mean, when you hear it on the hypnosis tape, it's really pretty. It's pretty wrenching. His response. He runs back into the car, and they take off down the highway. And they feel this buzzing, and then they feel buzzing again, and they're 30 miles down the road. Without being able to really account for how they got there. They make a brief stop in Concord to see if they can find a cop or some coffee. Can't find either. I should say this is all taking place like between like midnight and 3 a.m. And then they drive back to Portsmouth. They get home a couple hours later than they were expecting. And that's kind of the story of that night. Although, they're clear that something happened. They're clear they saw a craft. They draw pictures of it. They don't bring their food into the house because they're worried it's contaminated. And so that's kind of where things stand at the, come the next morning. And then you want me just to kind of go on with the story?
Well,
I mean, I
so
don't.
yeah. Well, let's stop there. So this is missing time. Like you said, there's several hours that are gone.
Right.
And this has become over the years, this is one of the hallmarks of abductions. This is and that term, missing time.
Yeah.
And this is the first time where didn't his watch break, or his watch,
Both of
am I
their
thinking of a different one?
no, both of their watches stopped at the same time.
Yeah. So I mean, it had to freak the hell out of them. I mean, just beyond that. So they knew something happened. They have missing time. They're scared their food is radioactive, for lack of a better
Yeah.
term. So what was it that eventually happened to get them from that point to the hypnosis, when the things change?
So a couple of things happened. One is within a few days of getting back, Betty has a series of dreams, these very intense dreams that aren't chronological, but are linked. And she writes them down it's like 4 or 5 pages long. And she titles it Dreams or Recall. And I'll kind of get into it a little bit more in a minute, but it's essentially the story of being brought aboard an alien spaceship and her interactions with these aliens.
So do you know from the dreams or recall, love that she had, was it the same dream over and over and over, or was it pieces falling into place and kind of like a jigsaw puzzle? Do you know if it was, which of those it was?
Yeah, what she says, I believe it's in the beginning of this document, or it might be when she was describing this document, is that the dreams didn't come, they were different and they weren't in sequence. So that when she put together the story, she had to kind of fit them in the right sequence. Right. So it like you're saying, it was sort of like a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces weren't quite in place. And part of her creating the narrative was her taking these different dreams and putting them in a way that made sort of logical, chronological sense to her.
And how long did that go on? Do you know?
I think it was like 8 or 10 days.
Okay.
It's a significant amount of time, but it wasn't like it was, persistent.
That in itself, like, I mean, I'm sure if you're a human being, you've had bad dreams.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to have, like, we all have nightmares, and maybe you even have a recurring nightmare, but you don't usually have it night after night after night. You have it throughout your life or over months. But can you just imagine, just after the third or fourth night, like, I don't want to go to bed. I don't want to close my eyes. I don't want to go back to this, because it wasn't the golden haired happy hippie aliens that we talked about earlier.
No, it's like Nightmare on Elm Street, right? It's like, I know what's waiting for me when I lose consciousness.
So this went on for almost 2 weeks.
Yeah. And then, so Barney, he had been seeing a therapist beforehand, I believe. But he certainly, his mental health suffered. He had some other, I think he probably had PTSD. He had one or two kids who lived with his ex-wife, who he was feeling estranged from. This is all sort of according to correspondence.
Yeah. Well, his granddaughter's a UFC fighter. Did you know that?
No, I had no idea.
She's a UFC fighter.
Oh, that's crazy.
She's a really good UFC fighter.
Wow. I had no idea. So he at some point, his therapist says, I think you could really use hypnosis therapy, and recommends this guy, Benjamin Simon, who practices in Boston, who was very well known and very well respected therapist who use hypnosis to deal with shell shock, or PTSD, with soldiers coming back from World War II and from Korea. So they go down. Betty and Barney go down together to meet with them, and then they went. I think it was maybe four or six times each. They would go down together and be hypnotized separately. And so this is where the story comes out. And it's largely told by Betty. And this is one of the interesting things about it. Betty tells this very rich story about, after they get that first buzzing, and after they've left the clearing and the craft, and they pull off a road, and they go off on this side road into the woods, and they see these figures in the road, like holding flashlights, and they pull up, and they think maybe a car's broken down. They pull up to it, and their car stalls, and they can't get it started again. And she starts panicking and tries to get out of the car, but a couple of the figures are already there, and they take her sort of, somewhat forcibly, and out of the car, and they start walking into the woods, and she can see this light in the woods, and she looks over, and Barney is also being brought along, but he's sort of somewhat levitating over the ground. Like his feet are kind of dragging along, but he's not, there's, he's somehow being suspended, although he's being accompanied by two other, I think she'd call them non-human beings, right? They're aliens. And they approach this ship, and she panics, doesn't want to go in. You can hear this. The hypnosis tape is really quite something.
So just so the people who are listening know, Strange Arrivals is the podcast that you do, and you can hear the tapes on the podcast, and I listen to them, and if she's making it up, like we will have the discussion whether or not she made it up, but whatever she's going through under hypnosis, she sounds like she believes every multi-second. It is very emotional, and it's coming from somewhere very painful and very terrifying for her. So it plays out on your show. So right now, I would tell everybody to go listen to it. Well, don't listen to it right now,
right. But get through this first.
After this, go check it out. So yeah, she's describing them, and he describes them as well, and it's fascinating to listen to the way that it comes out.
Yeah, I mean, she's terrified.
She's terrified. It's not a la-di-da, like, hey,
right.
Like I was walking through the woods and all these wonderful things happen. It's, we are being abducted. We are being against, this is something terrifying that's getting pulled out of her.
Right.
Not just like, oh, let me tell you a fun story. So she's being led. Barney's being pulled.
Yeah, he's sort of semi-conscious, she thinks.
Okay.
And Barney doesn't, and I'll get to this in a minute, but Barney's recall of this is a lot hazier. He basically says, I kept my eyes closed, and I think he's praying to himself for a lot of it. So it kind of goes by with him trying as much as possible to sort of pull back mentally from the situation. So they go on board, they're separated, they're into two different rooms, and Betty gets an exam. But what's interesting is that it's a very sort of 1961 kind of exam where she's sitting in or maybe Barney's sitting in a chair. She's on a table, but you know, they're taking little pieces of skin, I think nail clippings. They're sort of examining her in different ways. And it's just it's funny because it just seems so dated. Like, I think if you were going to talk a bit now about being abducted by some, you know, far advanced civilization, you'd think that you'd be put into like an MRI machine, or there'd be some kind of scanning going on or whatever. And this isn't what's going on. They're like taking skin samples and stuff like that. And you know, she starts to get a little more comfortable with what's going on. She has names for a couple of them. And there's this one she calls the interpreter, who can speak with her. And so she ends up having this conversation with him, where, yeah, it's she asks him where they're from, and he pulls out this star map, which will become big later. And it's not like a paper map. It's almost like a kind of a hologram. And she says, okay, well, where are you? And he says, can you identify on this map where your son is? And she says, no. And he says, well, then what's it going to matter? You're not going to understand if what I point at. You're not going to know where that is. So he puts it away. And then they, you know, as I said before, Barney, you know, got his teeth basically blown out during the war. So he had fake teeth. And apparently while they were examining him in this other room, they removed his teeth. And then they found that they couldn't remove Betty's teeth. And this was, the aliens found this confusing, and were asking her what was going on. And she said, well, when people get older, sometimes they need fake teeth. And she has this sort of weird conversation where they're like, well, what's older and what's age? And then it kind of, it's this very strange thing, which eventually ends up with, they're asking her, like, what is food? Like, what's a food? And she says, squash. That's what comes to mind. And they're like, and she describes it as yellow. And they're like, what's yellow? And she just like gives up on the conversation, as you would. And so they eventually, the aliens finish up with their exam, but it also includes sticking a needle into her abdomen, right? And this is something that'll come up in the next 50 years of alien abduction stories, is this interest in reproduction. So she feels like it's almost like an amniocentesis test or whatever.
Yeah.
So they stick a needle into, I guess, her uterus. And so anyway, they get returned to their car. Ship takes off, and then they drive away, and then they get the buzzing again, and then, you know, that's when they came to, and the original night, 30 miles down the road. So this is what they're saying. This is what Betty came to believe is what happened during these 2 hours that they can't account for.
So that's it's like you said, it's like, so I remember reading these stories probably around, maybe a little after you, around like in the late 70s, early 80s was when I was a kid. So I remember reading, you know, hearing about it and reading these stories, watching that stuff. And at that time, I remember hearing that about the needle and some of these things that they would say. And at the time you were like, ooh, that's sciencey, because at the time that's what we had. Right. But now in 2021, you look back at it, and like you said, like, wouldn't they put them in an MRI machine? Like, wouldn't their tech be way more advanced than what we even have now? Or are we dealing with older generations of aliens? And then there's the whole idea that people talk about where it's actually not aliens, it's possibly us in the future, that we're, you know, trans dimensional kind of stuff, you know, and the conversation about what is food, what is yellow, you know, it I I don't know if I call my I'm some a question I want to ask you. So let's put a pin in that for a second. So where are you on the spectrum of belief? Like we kind of touched on this when we talked the other day, but like if you had to describe yourself, what's where are you on all that? Generally, you don't have to get way into it, but
Yeah, I'm generally a skeptic. I think like I'm sort of like there's nothing that I've seen or heard or been shown that seems at all like proof that we're visited by aliens. And and we can talk about that some more, but I just there's all these stories, and which I think are just super interesting and very rich, um, for reasons other than they might be describing visitors from another planet, right?
yeah.
Um, so I guess that's kind of where I fall, is that I would, I'm open to the possibility, but there's nothing that anybody there's nothing that's crossed my path that has me seriously questioning it. And I've had two in the last 10 years. I've seen two things in the sky up in New Hampshire, up on a lake in New Hampshire where we have a summer place, that have been weird, that
Mm.
I can't tell you exactly what they are, but I feel quite certain that the answer isn't alien visitors. But they're both sort of head scratchers that days afterwards it's like, yeah, I still, even from this far removed, there's nothing that's occurring to me about what would be a good explanation for it.
But you're not going to jump right to you saw something in the sky. You're not automatically going to go, oh, aliens. Has to be
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
110%.
there's so there's so many things that I wouldn't even know.
Yeah.
Quite honestly, uh, you know,
And you interviewed uh David J. Halprin, and I'm going to put the
yeah,
J in because I found out that there's another scientist who's named by the same name who researches human sexuality. So I want to make sure
okay,
that we're
yeah,
talking about the right
yeah,
person.
okay, yeah,
But first of all, he is an interesting cat.
yeah,
He's got some very interesting insights on a lot of things. There are a lot of things that had me shaking my head. He's also got a really interesting way of talking. Um, but like his in a nutshell, and I'm so oversimplifying this, but his idea is that UFOs and aliens aren't real. They are. Let me change that. UFOs and aliens aren't out there. They're inside. They're manifestations of the human psyche to a certain extent. That's kind of what I got from it. Like I said, he's an interesting cat. He's got a lot to say.
yeah,
But yeah, like the spaceships are actually mandalas, and that it's our projection of our inner needs and our inner beliefs. And it was that was a hell of an interview, man. That
yeah,
was just wow. I need a thesaurus at one point. I had to like
yeah.
pull it out.
He wrote a book called The Intimate Alien, and it kind of lays out this, and I wish I knew a little bit more about like sort of Jungian theory, and things like that, because I think that's part of where this stuff comes from. But his idea is as you were saying, that it's UFOs are sort of a projection of sort of these sort of collective um ideas or symbols,
Mhm.
in which I think it doesn't necessarily mean that when you project them that it's not just something that you necessarily you see, but that it does have some kind of if not physical, but sort of a visual representation that other people can also perceive.
Yeah,
um
it's like a
yeah,
collective belief, psychological belief kind of thing. That's that. It's hard to put your finger on.
Yeah,
It's a really high level thought level that he's working at with what he's throwing out there.
yeah, I would, I thought it was a really interesting interview.
Yeah.
And so that's, if
Well,
it sounds interesting, you can check it out. But he has an
yeah, it's
interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, well, I was just gonna say it's like if you start, and I'm sure you've heard these interviews too, is there seems to be kind of like two parts to it, two sides to it. And there's the one side where it's like there's certain parts of society that say, I don't want to be alone in the universe. Not that we aren't, but I don't want to be, because they look up in the sky and it's scary that it's this huge, dark, infinite place. They don't want to be the this little blue and green globe that in the middle of nothingness. So they look out and they're like, there has to be something else out there. Not playing the percentages, because that's where I am. I play the percentages. I'm kind of like, the universe is so vast and so big, and there's so much out there. There's gotta be something out there, whether it's aliens and flying saucers. Sorry to our friend from the 40s, but or it's amoebas, or there's got to be some form of life. It has to be. But they play this idea like, I don't want to be alone in the universe. That's a scary thought. So you have that side, and then you have the other side. It's kind of like the Neil deGrasse Tyson side, if you've ever heard him talk about it. And he kind of goes like, how full of ourselves and egotistical are we to think that even if there were anybody out there, that they would care about us?
Yeah.
And so it's these two warring factions in a way. And so I wonder how the psychological aspect of it manifests, like David Halpern was saying, is it just comes out this fear of looking, mankind thousands of years ago, looking up into space and being like, okay, there has to be something there. Let's make them gods.
Right.
Let's the twinkling lights or Apollo's fires or whatever. It's
an interesting thought, and I think it feels differently at different times. At least that was my sense. Taking a look at Betty and Barney Hill and what things in the sky meant to them at that point in 1961, when we had less than 10 satellites up there. We hadn't put a person on the moon. I mean, the universe was a vastly more mysterious place. Like, it's one of the, while I was doing research with this, and I found it so weird that I put it in the podcast, but there's a book it's called the UFO conspiracy, I think, flying saucer conspiracy. But it's by a guy who's in the Marines, who was the head of sort of one of the large civilian UFO investigation organizations. And he writes this book where he's sort of speculating that, there could be alien bases on Mars or on the dark side of the moon from which they're flying these missions, and that it's interesting that there's more UFOs when Venus is closer to the Earth and stuff. So it's making these speculations about things which now, we clearly, that's nonsensical. But at the time, even if it was nonsensical then, we didn't have the knowledge there. So you look up at the sky and it's just, it's a mystery. Whereas now, I think my sense from sort of trying to read between the lines in what some of the stories are, is that there is this concern about, I think, about what we're what we're doing to our planet, and the hope that there is, there are other places that don't have these problems. I mean, I might be.
Are you the planet, like the idea of getting off this planet? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Or just even, I don't think it's even just getting off this planet. I think there's a sense of, I'm not even sure if it's responsibility, but the idea that, the earth, which is like the one place where we have to live, is, depending, I guess depending on what you believe, but it is being made less and less habitable. And I think, I know like guys like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. I mean, that's stuff they think about when they're going off into space. Is how do you get away from this?
We effed it up. We got to go somewhere else.
Yeah. Or just the idea that there's another place that maybe hasn't done it.
Yeah.
But there's, I'm kind of getting a little off track.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. So
I mean, there's so many, like even now I've got like in my head, I've got like 5 different directions I want to go with this, but let's go back to Betty and Barney for a second.
Yeah.
So one thing that I thought was interesting is you talked about Barney and how he was probably suffering from PTSD from the war and what happened to him. And then you talk about how he kind of pulled back during the experience. Like he was kind of closing his eyes, and you mentioned like praying or these different things. From what you've learned about it, do you think that his PTSD played into his experience and the way that he reacted to it and the way he responded to it?
No, I think what happened, and this is what the Dr. Simon, the guy who hypnotized him, thought. So it's not something I came up with, but I think he's right. Is that essentially the stories that were told under hypnosis were Betty's dreams. She had these dreams and came to believe that they, as she says, as the title of this thing, dreams are recall. She comes to believe that this is stuff that actually happened, so that when she's hypnotized, what she tells is this sort of detailed story based on these dreams that she had and that she wrote down and she talked to people about, right? So it's not just like she had them and then she woke up and never addressed them again. She wrote them down. She talked to people. She talked to UFO investigators. She talked to her sister. And I think it was her sister who said, maybe those weren't dreams. Maybe those are memories. So what Dr. Simon thought was that, so you have Betty telling this very rich story, and then you have Barney telling this much foggier story. And that's because when he's under hypnosis, what he's doing is imagining his part in Betty's story. But because he hasn't had that sort of intense experience with the story that she has had through dreaming and talking about it, he's just trying to fill in things. And so he doesn't have these details. So it's like, my eyes were shut. And then the one time he opens his eyes, what he describes is more terrifying than what Betty describes, which again, I think he talks about seeing in the field. He talks about seeing a guy who's dressed like a Nazi and an Irishman. And then when he opens his eyes, it's this sort of nightmarish vision. It's like this creature who's got like a membrane over his mouth. And I think he's making a sort of heavy breathing sound. And it seems more like alien than it does like Betty's thing, which is like basically smaller, not quite humans, but humanoid.
Yeah.
Type
he wanted
creatures.
To have a conversation with her.
Yeah. And she,
things.
And later in life, she spends a lot of time trying to get them to come back. Right.
Oh,
and
really?
Yeah. There's this whole, one of the, I guess you can look at it different ways, but she kind of starts seeing aliens everywhere. And she kept this notebook about her experiences and experiences she hears about. And I drive on these roads all the time. None of this stuff has ever happened to me. Like trucks being picked up off the road and being rotated and put back down again, and seeing squadrons of UFOs coming off the ocean onto shore. And it's just this like she's constantly seeing UFOs just in her normal life. And she brings people, she becomes sort of a UFO celebrity. People come to visit her. They go out into fields to look for UFOs. So she really, she goes pretty hard into it.
Do you
Um,
believe now? You said that you knew people that knew her or part of the
yeah,
family. Do you
yeah,
believe that she believed what she saw after the fact, not the initial incident, but like you said, the trucks and the things, or was there's that argument, you got to play devil's advocate. There's you become what people want you to be in order to continue the mythology of it.
yeah. No, I think that's right. So the people who the one I've talked to a couple of people who knew them. One person is a friend of mine who I talked to at greater length, and she mostly knew them before Barney died. So I think Barney died in 1968 or 69. And so Betty sort of became more extreme after that. And I think part of it was, you know, maybe loneliness and just the incredible amount of attention she got. I mean, she's a real celebrity in UFO circles, and she was, she's a great storyteller. You can listen to her talking on radio shows or giving presentations. She's got she's a she's got a lot of sort of this strange charisma, and
Mm.
she's very affable, and it's funny. She's a great talker. Um, so I think that's my sense of what it was, is that she's, providing grist for the people who are sort of encouraging her to kind of keep this sort of family of UFO people around.
When did she die? Do you know off the
She,
top of your head?
I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, something like
Okay.
that, a
So
little bit
she outlived
less.
him by a
Yeah,
ways.
he died young. He was in his late 40s, I think.
Do you know what he died of?
I I think I do, but I'm not 100% sure. So I guess I'd
Okay.
rather not just
I don't. It just
throw
it.
something out there. It wasn't like a heart attack. He might have had an aneurysm.
Okay.
It was something sort of
Yeah.
sudden.
He didn't like drink himself to death because of the experience or
No, it
anything. It
wasn't like
wasn't
it
anything
wasn't
like
it
that.
wasn't like that. No, it was like a sudden medical thing.
It seems interesting because so you go through this period from like 47 to kind of up through the 70s. I could be off on that by a little bit, but the heyday
Mhm.
of abductions and sightings, and while there were, you had Project Blue Book, and you have all of these different programs and the Men in Black, and that kind of seemed to filter off in like the 80s and 90s, even though then we had the X-Files. But
Yeah,
then it was all about Area 51, and it was about Roswell, but it wasn't. It was a retro thing. It was looking back and about the government cover-ups, and what's going on, and all of that stuff. But we didn't have a lot of sightings. There were a few, but it wasn't like this heyday that it was. And
right.
then now it seems like we've come back to that, because now you have the military has come out with their videos and the tic tacs, and the government saying, yes, we have these documents, we're not quite sure what some of these are. And it seems like there's a resurgence and all that, kind of going back to like was it the Phoenix lights a few years
Yeah.
ago, that big thing. It just seems like an odd cycle. It
So
seems like
even
it's resurged into the consciousness.
yeah, and I think it's even more so in the 80s and 90s. There was it seemed to be dominated by abductions stories. It wasn't sightings, it was abductions. And this is when um John Mack, who was a psychiatrist at Harvard, a
Mhm.
very well regarded, I think he worked with children. This guy Bud Hopkins, who was an artist, and David Jacobs, who was a history professor, I think. And they ended up sort of believing that, hundreds of thousands of people were being abducted by aliens, but most people didn't remember it.
Hundreds of thousands.
They did a they did a survey. They felt like they could identify things through a survey, through your answer to certain questions could help identify whether you showed signs of having been abducted without remembering it.
Oh, like reading between the lines based on your answers. And
yeah. And
okay.
So it's a long, I can't remember. It's got some pretty innocuous name. And they ask you a whole bunch of questions. They think they can narrow it down. But there were, during this time, there was a few like really, big selling books that came out with these, these claims, and John Mack being this Harvard guy, I think he got special notoriety for sort of buying into it. Bud Hopkins sort of started the whole thing. And what I thought was kind of interesting is that so Betty and Barney Hill, like they kind of set the template for alien abductions. It's like you're brought on board, your memories are erased, you're missing time. There's some sexual aspect they're interested in reproduction. And the story kind of escalates. And then you reach this point with those three guys where it's like pushed about as far as it can be. It's not like a person here or there on some country road late at night. It's hundreds of thousands of people. Stories about people being brought on and under hypnosis, remembering seeing like a room with a whole bunch of humans, like alien human hybrid babies that humans are brought up to kind of, provide some nurture to, because the aliens don't know how to, give emotional support to babies. It's very, very weird.
Well, apparently they don't know how to feed them, and they don't know what squash or yellow is.
Yeah, exactly.
So
or they have teeth. The consistency is not a strong point. But what I thought was kind of interesting is that the three of them, they have these very different outlooks about what they think the aliens want, like what's behind all this. Whereas Jacobs thinks it's sinister, and Mac has got this kind of new agey idea about how they're coming and it's going to be great. And then Hopkins, he just thinks his conception of them is just these absolutely cold, they're just doing experiments. It's just like absolutely cold, emotionless sort of scientists.
We're lab rats.
Yeah.
Okay.
And and again, I don't think I'm the only person who's kind of thought about this, but he's a modern artist, and it just seemed like such a psychological projection about how technology is sort of encroaching on our lives, and the things that he valued, like art and stuff, are becoming less and less central to people, and so he kind of envisions this kind of threat to people as being these, sort of ultra technological, cold, emotionless, feelingless creatures. So, but that was kind of the end of it. It kind of all fell apart.
And that was in the 80s?
80s and 90s. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it all kind of fell apart, under the weight of these incredible claims. There were some people who kind of, some people who kind of took advantage of it. There was clearly they weren't sort of following sort of sound scientific principles while they were doing their research. Mm-hmm. And that kind of, it just kind of fell off the map. And then sort of coming into that void has now been this new sort of interest more in what they call nuts and bolts. It's like, what are these things that are flying around our battleships, right? What are these things we have videos of?
You start getting into like Bob Lazar, and you start getting into like the engines and the physics of it.
Yeah.
Do the Russians have it? Is it Russian? Is it Chinese? Is it alien? Is it past? And the whole discussion's changed. It evolves every 10 years or so. It turns into a
Yeah.
totally different interest.
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, that's kind of, again, I think it's a lot, it's largely culturally driven in some ways.
Yeah.
It's what seems to be, what seems to attract people's attention. Like what's going on now, I don't know.
You've seen the videos. You've seen
I've seen the videos.
What do you think?
You know, it's just another one of those things. It's like, why can't you just get a good photo? Like, you've got the entire, United States military. We got satellites all over the place, and then when it's like, oh, we got this video that we can't explain, and it's just these completely, like, you can't describe what those things are. I mean, it's just like these dots or these sort of blobs.
That was my thing, is I kept hearing people talk about it, and I hadn't seen the video yet. And I was like, oh my God, definitive proof. This is amazing. And then I watched the gimbal video and the Tic Tac video and some of those. And I'm like, really? That's it?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly like you said. I'm like, high res. And then the fighter pilot talked about it. He's like, well, it's radar camera and it's this and it's that and it's that. And it's like, come on. You don't have an HD camera on that carrier?
Yeah. And apparently, I guess it's the Tic Tac one. It's like a heat signature for some kind of jet, and it's kind of a known thing. Like you can look it up on the web and see comparisons.
Yeah.
There was I don't know if you saw, there was a photo that I'm not gonna be able to remember the name of it, but it's sort of like a new web magazine that covers military stuff, but is also interested in UFOs. And they said they had this photo that had been confounding, like people weren't in the Pentagon, just couldn't figure it out, and they had it. And I saw it and I was like, this is the kind of thing that I can work with, right? It's a picture, it's taken from the cockpit. It looks like somebody, like they had their iPhone or something with them, and they're way the hell up in the sky, and there's this silver thing that's there, and it's you can see it. I mean, it's at a distance, so when you blow it up, it gets pixelated, but it's clearly a thing, right? And you can kind of describe it. So they put it up on Twitter, and the thing flashed on. It's like, half an hour, we'll show you this thing. I was like, all right, I'm up for that. Followed him on Twitter. Half an hour later, there it is, a picture. I'm like, wow, that's pretty wild. Within 20 minutes, it had been identified not only as a Mylar balloon, but they identified which Mylar balloon it was. It was a Batman Mylar balloon.
No way.
And they showed you where you could buy it on Amazon. And I was like, all right. So you finally see something that's like, yeah, that's a thing. And it's a Mylar balloon. But even when that was over, I was like, okay, but this is what I like. That's the kind of image that you just don't see.
Yeah.
Right. And they for whatever reason couldn't figure it out themselves, but it was compelling. But easily explained. And what I'd like to see is something that's compelling and not easily explained. And I haven't seen that.
You haven't. Why aren't they landing on the White House lawn? It's that old argument.
Yeah.
There's a guy, I forget his name, but he claims that he has pieces of metal from when, I guess there was a famous event where they scrambled the Air Force in Washington, D.C. I want to say it was in the 60s. I might not be right on that one. Where there were UFOs over Washington, D.C., and they shot at one. And he claims he has the metal that was shot off the plane. Not off the plane, I'm sorry, off the UFO. And it's that kind of stuff. And it's like, there's a point where it's like, come on. If it's out there and he's teasing people with it, it's like, you need to come forward and actually have a discussion about this. It gets pretty crazy. What's the response been to the show? Like, how have you gotten any feedback from listeners, or anything good, anything bad?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of falls along what you'd expect. I mean, there are people who, they're skeptics it starts off. It starts off with a pretty straight telling of the story, and I have Betty's niece like tells a lot of the story, and then there's tape from the hypnosis sessions, and there's radio and stuff. But it's a pretty, like, I feel like you had to kind of lay out the story before you could start to take a look at the different components and like what some of the problems might be with it, and what some of the explanations might be. So there's some people who I think were skeptics who listened to the beginning and are like, this is ridiculous. He's just telling the story again. And then got out, and you can see they leave little things like, I can't believe he's so gullible to believe all this stuff. And then there's other people who were, clearly are invested in that story, who then feel as though I'm not being fair to them, or that I'm I'm too credulous about explanations.
You can't win
for things. Yeah. I mean, there's two sides to it. So you're going to upset one side or the other. I think most people, I've gotten a lot of people who say it seems fairly even handed. The people the production people I worked with, I mean, it just sounds, I'll say it, cause I don't take any credit for this part, but it sounds really good. Like
it does. I really enjoyed the presentation.
It's very sort of immersive.
Yeah. Definitely.
And so they did a great job. But yeah, I mean, it's people have strong feelings about it. And as I found out.
And then in season 2, you get into Rendlesham Forest.
Yeah.
Is that how I pronounce it?
Rendlesham.
It's like the British Roswell. It's a Air Force base, right? I admit it, I haven't listened to the second season yet.
It's an interesting. So I'll give you just the skinny on it, which is that it's a sighting that takes place over 3 nights on in between these 2 Air Force bases in Britain that were basically run by the U.S. Air Force. So it's multiple people on 2 of the 3 nights seeing something. And this is in 1980. And so again, it's a similar type thing, kind of tell the story. I talked to 3 of the witnesses, and they kind of tell their story, and there's most of it's fairly consistent. They kind of splinter off at parts. And then sort of talking about what the sort of non-alien explanations for it might be. But looking at it as an example of how do you create folklore, right? And it's this idea, and folklore doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. It just means that you're getting this kind of information from informal sources.
Right.
And so how do you create folklore? So it goes from that. I go back and I take a look at, Project Blue Book, up through the end of the Project Blue Book at the end of the 60s. And then sort of this really weird government Air Force effort to spread disinformation into the UFO community. And I interviewed this guy named Richard Doty, who was sort of the guy who was at the forefront of spreading this disinformation. And just about how this disinformation that he was spreading finds its way into the UFO folklore. So it's all these different components to get you, or to get our culture to where we are now. And I sort of started off, we couldn't get the rights to this, but the way I wanted to start it off with is that there's a Jimmy Kimmel thing where he has Obama on, and he's like, I don't know how it comes up, but he said, Jimmy Kimmel's like, right after I'd been sworn in, I would run back to the White House. I'd say, give me the files on Area 51. And, everybody loves it. Obama's like, well, that's just another reason why you won't be president. And, but everybody's laughing because everybody knows what Area 51 is. Right.
Yeah.
And it's just like this, culturally, it's ubiquitous. Like everybody knows it. And the question is why, it's like this weird UFO theory. And government really hasn't addressed it, but it's just everywhere.
Well, they had the Naruto thing where everybody ran out there and we're going to go run through the gates. I went out there once in would have been about 97, 98. We actually went out, drove down the road, drove past the black mailbox, drove down to the point where the signs were, where it says, do not take pictures. And I will admit that was 30 years ago. But what I remember was seeing the white Bronco on the ridge that was there. And then I remember cameras in the bushes. And I remember distinctly one camera moving, like a motion camera. And I admit 30 years ago might have been tainted a little bit by, history and mythology and everything. But hell, this was before Independence Day too. So like they didn't have the movie with all the crazy stuff that went on, but we went to the Little Alien and we did all that stuff, but you feel something, but I don't think it was aliens. It's a test place. It's a place for, where they're testing rockets and airplanes and stuff. And I interviewed Mark Hall Patton, who he's a historian from Pawn Stars, and he was talking about it too. And he's like, you would be shocked how many people come through and they're just like, I have to convince you about Area 51. He's like, I'm a history museum guy. Don't like, you have to go out there. And he's like, I do history. But that was a crazy experience. With Project Blue Book. Did you run across the thing where they said that the misinformation was because they were getting so many reports that they were worried that the Russians were going to use it for like misinformation? Because that's the story that I've heard starting to come out.
Yeah. So that was actually in their recommendations. Was that so? The concern, they weren't concerned that there were actually aliens visiting us. What they were concerned is that sort of the credulousness among the population that there might be aliens visiting us would be an opportunity for the Soviets to use that to sow panic and gain a strategic advantage in that way. So they recommended that in schools teach critical reasoning and things like that, so that people can evaluate what they see and not panic in those situations. And that was actually, at the time, the idea was, and it kind of, in some ways, goes back to the Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, where people supposedly panicked and jumped from windows and all this stuff, which turned out to not be the case. That was just an urban legend. Yeah. But there was this sense that, people will panic and the place will turn into pandemonium. And what sort of social scientists in the 60s found out was that was actually not the case. That isn't what happens. People don't just like completely freak out. People sort of respond rationally and try and, help each other and get through things rather than, running wild in the streets.
We all work together. We all come together.
Yeah, exactly.
Hold hands as the aliens come and save the planet. What about season 3? Do you guys have plans for season 3 yet? You're doing Roswell, aren't you?
No. I did a little bit on Roswell in season 2. And about how, what people don't understand that Roswell was like a thing very, very briefly in 47. And then between 47 and like 1979, it just wasn't a thought. Like there's nothing in Project Blue Book about Roswell.
Don't tell that to the people of Roswell.
But then in 1979, 1980, a book was written by this guy, Bill Moore, who gets involved in a bunch of other things that I kind of cover in season 2. They write a book about Roswell, sort of making the case that it was, a crash saucer and there were bodies and all this stuff. And then suddenly it like has this whole new lease on life.
Yeah.
And so that sort of led to this theory by this guy who writes for the Skeptical Inquirer called the Roswellian syndrome, about how these UFO stories, like a sighting will happen, it'll be debunked, it kind of goes underground, and then it comes back up again in this sort of new form that sort of explains away the earlier debunking. So it's kind of armored
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then becomes more a part of the culture. And that's sort of what he says happened with Roswell, and then a whole bunch of other similar
As
sightings.
Roswell go, like, for those of you, a lot of people know, and I told you this, I was a reporter for the Roswell Daily Record.
Yeah.
So I lived and worked there for a short amount of time. And it's an interesting town. I mean, it lives and dies by that legend. That's their tourism. And it's really important that whether or not you believe it, it's really important that story stays alive, because it brings a lot of money into that town. So, I'm not pointing fingers, but I definitely would say it is in their interest for that story to continue to resonate. I mean, they have a festival every year. You drive down the street and the street lamps look like aliens. They literally have alien heads on the street lamps. There's the museum. There's a couple festivals. There's a UFO on the newspaper. I have a little alien doll that I was given as a reporter who holds the newspaper on my shelf over there.
God.
It's important that legend stays. And that, God, what is it? I think when I was there, it was like $50 to go out to the ranch. It was not cheap to go out and take the tour.
Go to Brazel's Ranch and take some photos.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is way outside of town. People don't realize how far it is from the whole thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's in their interest for that to stay alive. And if you talk to people there, you're like, do you believe? And they're like, absolutely. Because it pays my mortgage.
Got to. Yeah. Well, I think it's, I feel the same way about the Betty and Barney Hill story, and the Roswell story is like, I don't believe that stuff actually happened, but there's something about those stories, right? I mean, they're so strong. They're so culturally resonant, that where all these other stories have kind of fallen by the wayside. Like, these stories have endured, and they've been like the Betty and Barney, like, you wouldn't have had any of this abduction stuff later without the Betty and Barney Hill story kind of creating that model.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think it resonates so much?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, I think part of it at the time was that, like, this was something, it seemed like something serious. It wasn't, again, like the contactees, like meeting these like beautiful men from Venus. It was like, oh man, like, this is a real story of a harrowing adventure. Like, it's like something from Jack London or something, except it's from the stars instead of a bear. But I don't know. I mean, I guess it must speak to certain things that we either fear or aspire to or something, but it's lasted. And that's kind of how I end up. Cause at the end of it, like, I didn't talk to anybody who thinks that Betty and Barney Hill were being anything other than sincere, right? There's nobody who thinks they're faking. There's nobody who thinks like they kind of threw it out there a little bit and then saw that people were into it and then kind of like embellished and stuff. It's like, no, they 100% believe that this had happened,
mm-hmm.
Probably erroneously. But so when it was over, I was like, trying to sum up sort of my feelings about the whole thing, because I find them to be very appealing as people and as a couple, and it really they just left this incredible story that they didn't really create, but it kind of came out of them, that to this day, making a podcast, I'm talking to you on a podcast about it, and there's zillions of other weird UFO stories or weird stories in general that haven't had that staying power. And I just think it's really kind of an interesting thing, and sort of a testament to that whole whatever it is that ended up with that story.
How long was it? So it happened in 61. He died in the late 60s. When
Yeah.
did it kind of hit the public consciousness? Because I know it was in a couple small books and was running around.
64
That's really when
is really
people.
when it hits it. Well, they do that, and then it's called The Interrupted Journey. I think it's 64, 65.
Okay, and it's just ever since
It's
then
mid
it's just been there.
60s, and then it explodes, and they're all over the radio.
Yeah.
They're on the radio with like Carl Sagan talking about it. Sagan was very dismissive of the whole thing. He wasn't having it.
Really, I always kind of thought he was like he wanted to believe. He was kind of like scientific Mulder. That's always how I kind of.
Yeah, no, he so in Cosmos, he actually, there's like this weird like 5-minute segment in Cosmos where he, we didn't even get into this, but Betty reproduced her star map on a piece of paper, like post hypnotic, drew what she, quote unquote, remembered seeing. And this woman who's a school teacher in Ohio, like, made these incredibly elaborate 3D models of the near galaxy in her living room by hanging beads from string. And it's just like these precise measurements and all this stuff. I've got pictures of it. It's crazy. And then she would take photos from different angles to try and recreate the star map that Betty had drawn. And she couldn't do it. And this is, kind of the weird part of the story, is she tried for a long time to do it, couldn't do it. And then a new star atlas came out with like new measurements. And there's 2 new stars that had been put in, and a couple of measurements changed. And she added those stars, and then she had a match. And what people say is, there's no way that star map that Betty drew could have been drawn with just human knowledge at that point. That knowledge had to come from somewhere else. And so Sagan wasn't having any of that. So in Cosmos, he does this whole thing where he's showing how you make patterns out of random dots and stuff.
That's interesting, because you said, when we go back to her experience, we talked about, they took the skin sample, they did the amniocentesis thing, they did all of that, which was science of the time. But you said it, but it feels like a hologram. It feels like a 3-dimensional map. That's what she was describing, right? It wasn't she didn't pull out the AAA map of the universe and be like, I can't fold this back together. But it was a 3D map, wasn't it?
Yeah, she was a little, those are the kinds of things that would sometimes get a little squishy. I can't remember exactly how she portrayed it under hypnosis. But later when she described it, she's like, oh, no, it wasn't like it wasn't like the thing at school where you unroll the map. It was sort of more techie. But the reality is that once we put up the Hubble telescope and we got all these much more accurate measurements about stars and stuff, Marjorie Fish realized that the models that she had, which were very accurate to what we knew at the time, once we had more information, that those star maps, her models weren't accurate with that new information.
Oh,
so
really?
That her identification had been off, that it wasn't legit. But it's a very sort of interesting and like kind of magical story. And when you see the pictures of this woman's living room with these beads just hanging in this black, I don't know if it was like felt or paper or what, but I guess a black background. It's really sort of magical in this weird way.
It feels, as you start to pull the details out and talk about it, it just feels really subjective, whether you're somebody looking at it, what you bring to it. Do you want to believe? Are you willing to look at it skeptically? Are you willing to look at it critically? You have Barney, who's we go all the way back to the beginning of the discussion. We talk about, well, he looked like a nice Irishman,
Yeah.
so he's bringing to it what his knowledge base, his perspective, his subjectiveness. And then Betty the same way. It's really its story where it's like you can believe what you want to believe and you can make more out of it and go on Art Bell and say this is what happened.
Yeah.
I know Art's been gone for a long time, but
Yeah.
so we got off track. We never talked about what season 3 was going to be. We got
Oh
we got
yeah. Well,
distracted.
that's still kind of bouncing around. I'm not even being coy. I'm trying to figure it out.
But there will be. Is that the plan?
Yeah, the plan is that there will be. Don't know what it's going to be about or when it's going to happen. But it's a matter of finding something that a case that's interesting, that even if it's been sort of picked over, it feels like there's interesting stuff to be said about it, and sort of teasing out sort of what's interesting in this beyond did it happen or didn't, is it real or not, because that's not really, there's plenty of people who do that. I'm sort of more interested in, what is this, how can we look at this, what does this tell us about other things, what can we, how can we expand this to look at some bigger issue.
Did it affect you? So as a reporter, as an outsider on this, the process of making the show and listening to the tapes and putting them together and talking to people, and how did it affect you? Like you said that it didn't make you a believer, it didn't waver you, but as you're introduced to this knowledge and hearing these stories, like what did it do to you?
It's an interesting question. I think part of it is, especially I think from either viewpoint, but you take a look at these stories and, your initial reaction might be to roll your eyes a little and just be like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that didn't happen. But in most cases, and there definitely are some people who are just making stuff up and whatever, but for most people, these are like major, quote unquote events in their lives that have tremendous effect on them. And I think even as a person who's generally skeptical, and it's being sort of respectful and honoring the fact that to some extent it's real and important to those people. And there's value to having ownership of that story, I guess. And that's something that I try and keep in mind, and I try to do, and I don't know if I always do it as well as I should, but to allow people who I talk to own their stories when I'm presenting them. And that doesn't mean that I'm not later going to say, well, this makes me think differently about it, or this calls that into question, but their narrative is theirs. And I think I came away with it thinking that there's a lot of value in that for that person, and that you have to, even if you're going to disagree, even if you're going to bring in things that call the reality of it into question, that the story, their story, that's not like that can be real to them, even if I don't believe it's. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it does. It does. It's kind of there. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it kind of sounds like you got to respect the fact that that's their reality and that's what they believe, whether or not, unless you can prove it and say, you know what, I have evidence that you are making this up, or I have evidence you're trying to, what's the old joke, like shenanigans,
Uh-huh.
you're up to something. Unless you can prove that, then this is their world. You kind of have to respect them, even if you're skeptical, and you can't step in and go, you are wrong. Well, what are you basing that on? Because I said that. Well, your feelings are unprovable, just like their feelings. So until you have something concrete, then you do have to respect their reality. I can understand that. That makes sense.
So that was, I think that was like, I don't feel like my basic outlook on it has changed a whole lot. As a matter of fact, I just feel like I'm like slightly better informed, but maybe taking the same thoughts. That being said, I mean, there are people who I talk to who have spent, years and years and years and years, who are smart people who are 100% believe that, we're being visited or people being abducted or whatever. But I don't see the evidence for it.
You're not having dreams 10 nights in a row and being scared to go to bed.
not about that.
No, everything came out okay for you.
Yeah.
So do you want to take a second to pitch your stuff, like where people can find you?
Sure.
Hit it.
Yeah, thanks. So Strange Arrivals seasons 1 and 2 are from iHeartMedia and Grim and Mild, which is Aaron Mahnke's production company, and you can find those on any podcast app. Also on Crime Writers On, which is a roundtable discussion every week on crime and popular culture. We review podcasts, documentaries, stuff like that. And again, those drop on Monday mornings, and they should be on any podcast app. And I'm occasionally on Twitter at Toby Ball NH. I'm not very consistent.
You have a website too.
Yeah, I've got a website called tobyball.com. I someday when I have some time, I'm going to update it a little bit. It's got a lot of stuff about my books, which I published 3 novels, 10 years ago. But you can find that information there.
All right. We'll make sure we put some links to those. Thanks so much for joining me, having the conversation. This was fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
I love all of these. It's just great to talk and go back and forth. And I enjoyed the show. I would really encourage everyone to go check it out. It's a fun listen. I did listen to a couple episodes while I was going to bed. So I was kind of fading off with, had my own dreams.
Yeah, that's what I had to say.
Like Betty. So, all right, man. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for spending some time with me.
Yeah, it's fun.
All right. Thanks, man.
All right.
For the highways of America, which for so many years were an assortment of as many designs and pavements as there were states, are now becoming one big road that can take you anywhere faster, safer, and more directly than ever before. What is this big road? Where is it going? How much has been built? How much is yet to come? These are questions we ask. Certainly traveling the entire system would be a memorable experience, but few of us have the time for such a trip.
All rights reserved. Viking Dog 2021.